2011 and that kind of early adaptation of like BBM, literally young kids, young marginalized kids, undercapitalized, due to kind of racial legacies, working class legacies. These were the kids who were running the streets. They knew more what was going on than the police, right? And it was a moment. If you care to pay attention and listen, we hear testimonies of them saying like, this is once in a lifetime. And if you've been had up and you've been stopped and searched, or your brethren's been stopped and searched, and how that emasculates you and is a humiliating thing, not just for you personally, but in terms of how you understand you and your community are viewed.
Your position in society.
Yeah. How you been?
Good. How are you?
I'm all right.
So how's everything going with the show?
We're nearly there. Not there yet. Got to finish a few things. Got to finish some archiving work. And I'm working with a composer called Alphamis.
No, that's one of my favorite. Remember, I think, was it you? Or so, I knew his work before, but you reintroduced me to his album that is on play. Anytime I have a studio visit,
Yeah.
he's like in the background, depending on the studio visit, but I normally have him in the background as like a soft entry. So as they walk in, it sets the atmosphere.
Curates the space.
Yeah, so people are like, oh, it's a good sound.
I didn't know that.
Good sound, yeah.
Alpha's incredible.
Very. He's like up there. Love it. He's from East as well, isn't he?
He's from East London. Respect to the crew.
Hold tight. Behind the scenes.
Yeah. He's we worked together before on Leave the Edges, and I'm just constantly on him about composing in other contexts, because he's an incredible artist, but also he's an incredible collaborator too, and you can tell from when you see him on stage and how he runs his band. It's just really cool to kind of watch how he goes about his work and how he goes about collaboration, because foundationally I'm a filmmaker. That's my foundational practice, so I've never really been a solo practitioner. It's always about bringing people in. Sometimes they're not necessarily ready to be brought in, but over the years, you develop a shorthand, a rapport, and ultimately, I'm a massive fan, and I don't think there's anything he can't do.
What made you start this whole uprise?
I mean, the form of this work really is creating an opportunity, not just for new visual language, but also to redefine what public art can be, right, in the digital era. And it just happens to be a piece of art about the digital influence in that moment. In the British context, fits within a wider global context, what was happening around the world in 2011. I love that, that thing about, Duchamp's thing about the artist studio being a lab.
Okay.
Where you can try and work with different forms, mediums, and just completely change up your practice. That's something that keeps me interested. That's something that keeps me challenged. It's something that keeps me engaged, and you're trying to figure it out. Not that there's ever any like objectively right answer, but something that feels right to you as a practitioner.
Yeah, I think it mimics life. It's constant reevaluating where you are within your life is like reflected within the artist studio. The choices that we make, what we choose to listen to, what we choose to eat, what we choose, what we choose to digest, what we choose to surround ourselves with. So the artist studio is very much, it mimics life in that respect.
Something I was interested in doing when I came up with this idea, which kind of goes back to, it's as old as art history, right? Like using artworks and whatever materials are at hand to chronicle and commemorate, memorialize moments in actual human history. It's doing two things, really. We're trying to do two things with this work in terms of, redefining what an exhibition can be, looking ahead as we go accelerate into our digital futures, right? And where digital doesn't become an add-on, it becomes like a core inherent part of how you think about art, how you engage with audiences, and how you build out from there, rather than an appendage after you've sort of, put together a show or, done a piece of work. So that's very much kind of where my practice is at the moment, in terms of censoring those sort of digital iterations of visual language and culture. It's something I definitely want to continue doing in the future in different ways, shapes and forms. But at the same time, it is commemorating, it is looking back, there's that thing about, Sankofa, you look behind you at what came before, the archival element of this piece, going and getting their testimonies and enshrining it in this piece of work. It does serve to kind of amplify and preserve, and that's important. That's very important. Whether you look back to kind of medieval Nigeria, where you got the materials at hand of brass, bronze, and all the Benin bronzes are chronicles of a time, chronicles of a society, and what was going on within that society. With the Obas, with the warriors, with the wars of expansion. You go through any element you like of the art historical narrative around the world, and you get that, you see the commemoration and the memorialization, whatever the materials, whatever the time, whatever the culture. So UPRISE is very much a part of that and sits in that tradition, just in 2021. I've got a preoccupation with power and how it's wielded, on a macro and a micro level. And I think that's why riots are really interesting for me, because it's the one moment when the people who should be, the people who naturally, hierarchically, structurally do not have any power or are usually willing to cede it to the state. It's that British policing idea of policing by consent. In these moments, we take our consent away. We do not consent. And particularly when you look at 2011 and how and why different communities were so quick to rise up and stand in solidarity with Tottenham, it was very much about anti-police sentiment. We withdrew our consent. You cannot overstate how significant that is, because it's so rare. Rioting and civil unrest is a British tradition, right? We can point to certain moments in our recent history and the same underlying factors keep coming up and coalescing around certain catalytic moments that cause mass disconfirmation, mass rioting, massive civil unrest, and confrontation with the police. Quite often the police have a hand in those catalytic moments, right, against black folks and people who are working to try and just, live. But 2011 was the first one of the digital era, and I don't think it's any coincidence that it was also the widest spreading and most sustained period of rioting in this country's history, because it unlocked those voices in a way that just, prior to that was more localized.
Yeah.
Could still be ferocious, like in the 80s in Brixton or Tottenham or Handsworth or Notting Hill back in the 70s and 50s. Really ferocious and, not anything you could ignore, but still localized.
Yeah.
Right? But that metastasization, that was a direct result of us becoming digital creatures. There's probably a practical element too, in terms of the corona moment that we've had. I mean, you put my last work in a show in October.
Yeah,
right?
5 hours. That was just before that lockdown, wasn't it?
It was just before the lockdown, the week before.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the piece that I put in it, The Love and the Magic, was very much about individual power, individual agency, and how there's no kind of, it's never benign. You're either using it or you're feeding it to be used against you, against the people.
Such a powerful piece. You don't necessarily have to write in order to have these conversations.
No, yeah, I agree. I mean, the only reason why this work resonates is because the underlying themes and drivers of that civil unrest, that moment, have only gotten more true. You know, they haven't dissipated. They've crystallized in a way that is very, very mainstream now. You know, whereas they may have felt a little bit more marginal back then to the mainstream discourse, and hence why 2011 caught everyone on the hop by surprise. You know, even though it was happening all over the world, that there was some sort of, and I still think there's a sense in Britain that, oh well, this can't happen here. You know, everything's fine, right? But that may have been the sentiment 10 years ago in terms of a mainstream sentiment, whereas I think now it's a lot harder to acknowledge, to not acknowledge that we have these ruptures and fissures and discords that need looking at, need addressing. It can't be swept under the carpet anymore, you know? So, yeah, therein lies the opportunity, therein lies the kind of secret sauce of why the work's gonna be, or why it's relevant today, really.
Coming from a lens and a time-based practice, why did you choose augmented reality as a medium?
Augmented reality is something I've been interested in for a while. I'd worked with other immersive technology before. I've been making a VR series called Virtual Black Reality for the last few years. And I've really enjoyed kind of the learning, the discovery of, you know, new visual language with that particular medium. Virtual reality, though, has certain limitations, access limitations. You know, I still don't know if it's truly ever going to be a mass participatory medium. But then that's where augmented reality comes in. It really allows the digital space and the sort of built environment to interact and be in conversation with each other. I wanted to kind of really wrestle with it, play with it, and understand how it could be of service, you know, to my practice and themes that are inherent to this work. So I was quite interested in how that could play out with these themes, these particular themes. And also, you know, I'm a moving image practitioner, so the chance to kind of combine the moving image with augmented reality, I'm marveling at how well they work together, and it's the two sort of technologies, the two mediums have combined to create something quite unique in a way. It feels like a new visual language, and it's something I haven't seen before. There's always been the next technology, right? There's always been the next medium. There's always been the thing that's been like bleeding edge, cutting edge. And oftentimes there's that question, there's that kind of tension between, is it art, you know, compared to more traditional forms or works or practices. And I don't think this digital era is any different.
What does the digital space mean to artists now after what's happened over the last 18 months? How has it changed? Or has it changed us?
I mean, that's the question, isn't it? Sometimes we're not going to know that until we go a bit further down the line.
Well, I think 100% it has definitely changed all of our lives, because there was like children who were learning, you know, through Zoom, and there was all of that. So it's like, that's just but the knock-on effect and how that's changed the art world, that's the question. But then you're kind of dealing with that now, aren't you?
Yeah, but I think it's different for every practitioner, isn't it?
So how do you think we both tackle the digital question differently?
You're more active on Instagram than me, innit? Right?
Is that a choice?
Yeah, well, I mean, apparently these days it's not.
Exactly.
But my Instagram game is weak, and I need to get better. I've been told, but it's not. I guess I'm more interested in using the digital, less for plug-in or messaging than I am in actually making the work. And I think that, there's definitely new opportunities in terms of how we're structuring this exhibition, for example. It's very much an exhibition without a gallery, right? We are working with 4, 5 galleries up and down the country, but not in a traditional way. We're very much kind of placing the actual augmented reality work itself in the streets to mimic that, as a nod to 2011, when people's digital lives were leveraged into kind of street action, and that's quite interesting, drawing that parallel from then to now with a new emerging technology that is just kind of being understood by the public at large, similar to mobile networking and social media. In 2011, there's been a lot of scrambling to kind of focus on what it could mean without necessarily having the digital sphere as something essential to practice, It's like a reaction to it rather than something that's kind of, well, in my case anyway, I've always had that interest in the digital sphere. And a lot of that really comes from trying to figure out, as we go through this, massively, exponentially increasing digital revolution, what does that mean for the sort of marginalizations and exclusions and prejudices that kind of came out of previous industrial revolutions and colonial eras. Now we're in the digital era. I've always thought about, how that can not repeat the same mistakes of the past.
Do you know of anyone that created any works that kind of highlighted or just kind of demarked that time?
That moment,
Yeah.
particularly that moment. There's a photographer called Akoto. He's in the States, who around the same time was doing these really beautiful portraits of the Occupy movement in New York. And I think there's, the interesting thing about that work and that time is, I think you need distance, because when all the news trucks left Wall Street and, all the police cordons left and that whole camp got disbanded, and, you're looking at this chronicle, these really beautiful works of art, these portraits which chronicle a moment, and a coalition, a coming together of different cross-sections of society who were reacting to what was a really seismic moment, that financial crash and the aftermath of it, and the repercussions of it. There was a real kind of disconcertment, I think, amongst everybody. What that moment really shows, I think, is all over the world, is that we were beginning to reckon with, I think people call it late stage capitalism, right? Which I love, because it's kind of like inferring that what late stage, so what comes next, but in a way that really shook people to their core, because even the people who believed in it the most saw that it was not quite working properly, And as always, the people who were like further down the tree, the most sort of disenfranchised, the most marginalized, for their voices to be heard, I think that was the sweet spot, that moment of that technological enfranchisement, you know, the advent of social media, you know, the dawn of the smartphone era. And in the British context, that's what UPRISE is exploring. Things were happening in Tunisia, in Egypt, Libya, Syria, still ongoing, Iran, you know, social media and the digital enfranchisement of the individual, just regular working people, hit this new moment in human history.
What was the dawn of the smartphone? What technology were we talking about there? What, like thinking about, I know it's like BBM, so it's like Motorola, without obviously mentioning the names that this is not an advert again. This is not
Other brands are available.
But like just thinking about how that allowed us to instantly connect, you know, past, you know, when you think about like the pager, because we came from, do you know what I mean?
You had a pager?
I don't think I had a pager,
I was
but
gonna say, what you did, they got a pager.
yeah, but I was like a part of that generation. Do you know what I mean? Like I think
GSM.
Yeah. It was
No, I
like
mean,
because it was like 90s, wasn't it? Like
it was 90s, and also it was like after the first .com crash in 99, 2000 or whatever. But yeah, what was then known as Web 2.0. Do you remember that?
yeah.
Right? And that was like the new thing at the time. And yeah, what was known as Web 2.0 in 2011, YouTube was only 5-6 years old.
I don't think I wasn't even aware of YouTube.
Yeah, you know, nobody had WhatsApp, you know, Instagram. Who had Instagram in 2011? When you marry together sort of the dawn of the smartphone as we know it, you know, that level of computing power in everyone's hand, in your pocket, which exceeds anything that, you know, your parents had in their houses or in their workplaces, with the level of bandwidth and, you know, mobile spectrum that's been auctioned off all over the world, you know, this is the dawn of a new era. You know, this is the delivery of all that promise that we had all through the 90s, you know, when people still on their dial-up, somebody was telling you, this is gonna be the future, guys, I promise.
Do you remember that?
Yeah, you know?
You know, for me, there was like a reoccurring theme throughout the work and the way that it's placed in the positions, that it has that kind of element of, you know, documenting history, but not just like, you're not just investigating and researching it and, you know, creating a piece that is, you know, it has a timelessness to it. Snapchat is like our archive. It's like in many ways, you know, the stories on our Instagram are now becoming our way of archiving information.
The moments, yeah.
So do you see UPRISE as an archival piece versus like a conceptual art or a contemporary art piece? And what's the relationship for you between the two of them?
It's both. It's not either or. I mean, this is the first time I've attempted to work with archival moving image. And that's exciting. It always held a bit of trepidation, you know, because you kind of have to have a really good reason to do it, a substantial reason to do it. And I felt that with this project, with these themes and with this moment that we were chronicling, commemorating, reframing and examining, again, that was a good enough reason, that was a hefty enough reason to kind of dive into that material and bring it into the augmented reality space, you know, again, in a way that I haven't seen before. And I very much found that as a challenge, but also an opportunity to create some new visual language that helps to kind of really engender a conversation between an audience, a British audience in particular, and and the work. One thing that I think we're quite keen, and when I say we, I'm talking about the people who are the subjects of the work, people who lived through that time, people who spent time in prison because of their actions at that time. And what we're trying to do really is kind of present a new way of looking back at the moment and understanding the moment, trying to unpack it a little bit in a way that really there was no space for it at the time. There's something about taking a moment in time and really trying to dissect it, you know, with the form of your work, you know, with how you choose to engage an audience, different types of audiences.
I mean, everyone's now a bit savvy when it comes to the
Now,
smartphone. Exactly. Exactly.
Back then,
10 years ago, 5 years ago, it was a very different conversation.
but the people who've matured with the technology, you know, and the even younger people who are kind of now in their 20s, you know, in their late teens, and you see them sort of striking for climate action, marching for Black Lives, you know, calling out Me Too, you know, with the same technology, but as a society, it just feels like we've matured with it.
Yeah, 100%.
You know, and you don't have that kind of violent, visceral, necessarily, that same violent, visceral reaction that you did in 2011, but I think you give anyone, any society, any young entity a new toy, as they mature with it, they kind of understand the nuances of it a bit more, how to wield that power a little bit more effectively, a little bit more targeted. You know, I look at today, I look at how we organize ourselves with our digital lives today, and compare it to 10 years ago, it is night and day. Like, we've learned, we've matured, and that's really interesting. And as you chart that back, and as you go back to that sort of first uprising of that digital era in the UK, I think there's a lot there to unpack and to kind of consider. And those are the conversations that we're looking to have with this work.
If you look at all of the kind of recent uprises or marches that we've seen, merchandise is like a hot thing.
Actual merch?
Like,
or like
not,
banners?
Yeah, but
sloganizing?
yes, but it's become like, whereas people used to just have, I think, this is me personally, people might just have their own individual one where it's just like, you know, I feel like it's like collectively.
You can get off of Amazon now.
Yeah, you're seeing like people like, there's a particular, you know, the colors were like kind of inclusive, but it is like, there is like a very direct narrative. It does feel very like capitalist. It does feel like it's like running that kind of train, to me personally.
Yeah.
But
I remember there's always gonna be a tension between deconditioning is so deep. Like if that, there are very few radical thinkers out there, right? I mean, let alone radical politicians who are going to try and put things in place to like how we live our lives and break that cycle of, you know, capitalist adherence that we all kind of participate in every day and have done for centuries, and has led us to this point, right? To really kind of go back and trace the origins of all of these things that we're all marching about now, and all of these things that all the voices are engaged in and have a platform for through social media and digital engagement. It takes, I mean, you can't truly do those things without really critiquing the capitalist kind of structures. And I don't think, from where I'm sitting, I don't think many of us, any of us, truly are willing to go down that road to the end, right? So then what you get is sloganizing, collectivism, merchandising.
you know, it's interesting that you say that, because I think back to like last summer we had during that Black Square movement that happened across
Posting Black Squares.
across social media, and I feel like that for me was the first time, especially like thinking about like art history in the context of like, you know, 0 point of painting and that kind of stuff. For me, that was the first time I was like, I had a bit of hope in terms of, because for me, it was like, you're removing anything, you're removing that idea of like, you know, brands or identity, and you're just positioning like this whole, like, it's almost like the resetting of the, I don't know.
The reset.
Yeah, because
Wow.
I kind of was, I bought into it. Like this idea, yeah, I know, because it was like, before the whole Black Square like was going across social media anyway, that was a part of my research within my practice. You know, Malevich's Black Square and what that meant for art history, and that like the cycle and, you know, the conceptual language around that. So when I saw that, I was like, okay, so maybe like people are
becoming mainstream.
Yeah, maybe people are understanding, like, in order for you to think that you can have like this blanket, you know, this kind of this zero point, you know, where there isn't that conversation, there isn't all these other noises that are happening, and then you get to just focus on what it is, you know, the questions and the history and the, you know, uprising that was happening 10 years ago. Well, it would have been like 9 years ago at that time.
So that's where you got the hope from.
Yeah, because
You saw you saw that mainstream, what you thought was a mainstream adaptation of the symbology. But I guess, I mean, when you saw, now we've had a year since then. Is that hope still there when you've seen what it actually consisted of and the follow through or lack of?
actually there was a time, because during that, on that day, I happily like posted my Black Square, which is still on my page now. But then there was like this kind of uprising, like people like sending all these messages, and then it was like people using it as an opportunity to market their own stuff again. So it was like,
This is where the bubble bursts.
exactly.
Right?
Because I was like, well, maybe this could be our time. Like, I actually had this hope that maybe like, you know, like in 1912 with Malevich, you know, and just like that period of time, like people were really rethinking language, you know, people's positions, the conversation,
Societal
exactly,
structures, yeah.
you know, institutes. And I was like, this could be our time. And then people started posting, nah, don't wear the Black Square, this and that, you know. Then you start people using it as like a tool to like, and I was just like, okay.
Cynicism's a real thing, you know. But I think as humanity, not just artists, but like all of us, we oscillate between those moments of hope and optimism and radicalism, right? And then like we just sort of snap back to the everyday kind of cynicism and like the realpolitik of our situation, right? And how you're gonna get on within this paradigm, you know? Because tearing it down requires like an inordinate amount of just balls and commitment and follow through that most of us just don't have. You know, between raising kids, looking after parents, trying to continue your artistic practice, you know, dotting the T's, crossing the I's. Yeah, you're gonna wear a beret, go burn it down, yeah, and rebuild it. And what's coming next? Like, I mean, that's the other thing that no one really talks about. Not enough anyway, for it to be viable. What comes next? Like, if we're all agreed that this is imperfect, right? And we can see those imperfections in our relationships with the climate, with our relationships with each other, you know, within our sort of international kind of relations in that geopolitical sort of space. And, you know, within myriad societies, minoritized communities, and, you know, everything that comes with those disparities. We can all agree that this is not nirvana that we live in, right? But the trickiest thing beyond the hope, because I think raising the rabble, raising the hope, kind of, it happens often enough every few years, decades. You can see like that's a thing, you know, peaks and troughs, it oscillates. But what comes next is the real thing. you know?
As you're saying that, I've just got Bob Marley in the background. It's like my soundtrack.
Which song? Which song?
No, you're like, so you put me on this. I don't want to sing it, but you know, like his song about unity and
Yeah.
It's like that's my soundtrack as you were just talking about. all these things.
Swagger. Make it happen. I don't know. I don't know that I'm an inherently optimistic person, which is a sad thing to say out loud, right? But yeah, I think there's as much empirical evidence about how often we fail in those moments and opportunities to be our best selves. As much as sort of us, or the best of us, regularly bringing about those opportunities in the first place, right? That you bought into last summer and then like had your bubble burst a little bit. So like, yeah, I can't say that I can see things getting better in that way, you know, in terms of our conditioning kind of being overcome by something new, something radical, something more.
It's baby steps though, isn't it? It's like it doesn't need to be like so radical. Just like tomorrow, like everyone has to
Revolution Bandem.
It doesn't have to be as like, strong as that, but it's just these small things. I mean, when you talk about optimism, like what did I read the other day? Optimism is intelligence, and to be pessimistic is will.
The choice.
Basically. And I feel like as an artist, these are the choices, like, going back to the conversation that we were having about life and how our practice reflects life. It's a choice. It's your, what you choose to listen to, ultimately.
Yeah.
And as an artist, it's like you can't help but to be, even if you call yourself a
pessimist.
Yeah. You're not, because it's your optimism that keeps the hope alive. It's your optimism that allows you to make the work, that allows you to keep on opening the doors. It brings in a new generation and then bring it to a new audience.
Yeah, I hear you.
Because if you were pessimistic, you would have just let it go. You would have said, fuck that. You would have just, exactly.
Maybe.
I don't know.
I'm weird. I don't think optimism and pessimism are mutually exclusive.
True.
Which is completely contradictory when I say it out loud. But there is something about them coexisting, I was listening to a James Baldwin thing with my son the other day. It would have been like mid-80s, not long before he died. And he was just sort of lamenting time that had passed and his role in the time that he'd lived and the contributions that he thought he'd made. But yeah, he was like, I've always been told, I forget the exact quote, but he's saying something about, I've always been told it's going to take time. Right, it's taken my mother's time, my father's time, my brothers and sisters' time, their children's time. How much time do you want? And I think making peace, reconciling yourself with kind of that horizon, that sort of, that length of time, that temporal space that extends beyond the horizon of your own lifetime. That's something that I'm only just starting to get to grips with. And that is where my optimism has to live. Right? Like when I was younger, maybe thinking about things happening in my lifetime, great, but like now I'm getting a few more gray hairs. And I'm watching my kids grow older. That's where the optimism has to live for me.
Yeah, I find that quite interesting because even after all the things that we've gone through over the last year, 18 months with COVID, like, do you not feel like there's been so much change? Do you not feel like the conversation has changed?
I don't know. I'm too close to it, I think. I'm very, you know that thing about the frog in the boiling water? It doesn't realize the water's boiling, and before you know it, like, I don't, certain things are happening, yes, and I see them happening. And I was marching last summer, and I felt it. I didn't change the square, but I felt it, because it was different. It was different from previous times. But yeah, I think I've seen, even within my lifetime, just as a student of history, I've seen that one step forward, two steps back, too often, And when you think about the lull, you got the civil rights movement, kind of the Black Power movement, even like the trade union movement in this country. They had their peaks just before my time when I was a little kid. When I was a kid, these were all things that I'd heard of, but they were petering out. Now I can look back and understand that they were petering out. In the early 80s, Black Power movement had been decimated, right, here and in the States. Trade union movement, Scargill, never been the same since, Wapping, Murdoch, all of these things that were really collective, structured, considered actions and coming together of marginalized people to kind of improve their stock in life at a structural level. They were being eroded, and the 80s and 90s really, they stayed eroded, and if anything, it's only since 2010, 2011, the aftermath of the financial crisis, everything we were talking about related to UPRISE and the dawn of the smartphone, digital, hyper-connected digital era. It's only since then that we've seen this resurgence, right? Like, in the Olympics, Black Power fist salute, Tommy Smith. Like, how long between that and Kaepernick taking a knee? We're talking decades, right? And you've had, in that time, Michael Jordan, Carl Lewis. You've had very, very prominent American sportsmen and women. You've had people in the UK, Linford Christie, John Buck. You know what I mean? It went out of vogue. The ebb and the flow of kind of like activism in public life, it went away.
But, okay, so I put this question to you. Did it go away or was it not archived? Because I feel like the reason why we have the conversation that you're like having now is because, there's a way to track it back. There's like, there's news that is documented, like more so. Like, you have people who are posting things, so that's like a way of archiving certain things. There's more, the internet, we can go and we can Google and search things now. There's so many Wikipedia pages on everything and anything. So when you think of it from that perspective, like, this kind of engagement is only going to change, it's only going to enhance the relationship that we have, because our children won't have to just go to us as the storytellers to be able to tell a story.
True.
They can go and, use the internet, use whatever, even the fact that this UPRISE, it's all over the country. It means that, as much as an 80-year-old would be able to go and use their smartphone to be able to access the QR code, so will a 5-year-old, or maybe a 5-year-old won't have it, but...
Yeah, 5-year-old just rolling.
Exactly. Well, not my 5-year-old, but it's 5-year-olds,
Other phones are available.
Yeah, other phones are available. But, so this conversation, it only ignites and extends the conversation versus closing it up. I know what you're saying about that. But then even when you talk to our parents' generation, the reason why those conversations close up is because where was it documented? The only way you could find it is if you went to the library, you know? Who was taking who's the keeper of all that information?
You know what? It's funny you should talk about that because, archival. Growing up, my two biggest sort of archival sources were West Africa Magazine.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I guess that was more from my dad's side. Sani Abacha, Babangida, like lots of military strongmen running kleptocratic states. And then Ebony Magazine.
Okay.
On my mum's side, I loved a bit of Oprah in our house, Then a bit of The Voice,
The Voice was very much,
Yeah, New Nation. So these were like in lieu of having the internet, and outside of just Peter Sissons on the broadcast news at 10 or whatever, these were the sort of curated kind of streams of information that were available. And it's interesting when you start putting these things together and you come out with a very, I come out with a very good blended view of like what power structures are, like both in the British and the wider kind of West African and colonial context, because I'm going to Ghana as a 4-year-old and I'm seeing like army and tanks everywhere and the person in charge is wearing military fatigues, right? So I'm like, what's that? What's a coup? Like, what's, and then watching the miners getting their heads cracked open by militarized police, I'm like, oh, it's the same thing here and there, And ultimately, what I came to understand at a very early age is, it doesn't matter if the people are getting their heads cracked are black or white, Africans or Yorkshiremen, the dynamic remains the same, right? It's the people who are willing to marshal the instruments of the state, that kind of state monopoly on violence, in order to get their own ends, whether and usually without fail, that is not in the interest of the people.
It's true, very true.
And yet it's accepted, and yet we as the people accept it.
But do we accept it?
We do, for the most part, except for the moments like 2011.
Like thinking about like what your source material was growing up, like I'm reflecting on my own, like, what was in my house. It was like, the Voice was again, was there. But then it was like, I think there was a moment when the Gleaner, the Jamaican Gleaner was like, coming
over.
Yeah, it made its way. So I was like, there was a Gleaner in my house. And then there was just like, from a historical point of view, if there was like, before Google, there was just like encyclopedia. So we had the whole...
Britannica.
Yeah, and there was another one. What was the other one? I can't remember. But, we had the whole A to Z. And so that's if I needed to know anything, my mum would send me there, But now, where do we send our children? I just wanted to go back to this idea of like race and rioting and marching and protesting, because I feel like that is something that, that we haven't really touched upon, because I feel, growing up, and especially like in my teenage years and going through London and living like around London and, working around London, marching and protesting is something that's always been. But, it was like, who's allowed to march? Because I used to work in Selfridges, it's not another plug, but, you used to have loads of people who were constantly, like, animal rights used to come in and march, fair.
Yeah.
And it was like... I can't, you know, I don't know the names.
okay.
We're not promoting any of you. No, I'm joking. But you know, like so like this has always been something that has been a part of society, as you said. But you know, it's when a person of colour or a black person chooses to riot, then they become villainized. And I feel like that is something that we haven't touched upon. You know, had the same group of people been, you know, I was in Edinburgh and people were marching for, you know, what was it? The environment. What's the
Climate action.
Climate, that's it. You know, was it
Rebellion.
Extinction Rebellion 2019. And it was very orderly. You know, the police were around, you know, everyone was like, there was kids, you know, women and baby, you know, there was nannies. It's like, you know, everyone was out, you know, protesting. And I think had that been a different crowd of people, you know, had they have not been middle class, upper class, you know, that conversation would have been a lot different. You know, on the news, it wouldn't have been like children took the day off school to protest for Extinction Rebellion. It would have been like tyrants. You know, it would have been. And I feel like, you know, even when we talk about, you know, the conversation about UPRISE, you know, when we looked at the people who were, you know, villainized, like, you know, victims in this, because they were victims, I personally believe, you know, they were always people of colour. Well, actually, I should take that back. But majority, you know, they were people of colour. Exactly. And, you know, how the media treated them, how they were spoken about, you know, the sentencing they were given. You know, you have people who destroy property and land and who, you know, do things in a way that had a black person have done the same thing, you know, automatically they would be given 18 months, whereas these people are given like maybe a slap on the wrist, not even community service, and said, well, you know, they are trying to change the world. But socially, it's always dependent on who it is saying that they want to change the world.
The respectability
Exactly.
of protest, of activism. That's actually one of the topics. Bolande is hosting that talk at the Blue Coat.
Oh, okay, sure.
Yeah, it's I think the title is The Respectability of Activism, whose voice gets to be heard. But yeah, there's one thing about 2011, it was nearly 10 years to the day after the massive sort of anti-war, Tony Blair, Iraq, George Bush, Berlusconi, you know, those marches, right, which are just down the road here. And those marches at the time were the biggest marches that we'd ever seen in the country, I think. It was a very genteel kind of moment, and it was politely ignored. And we went to war, right? 2011 was really interesting, that, you know, it wasn't genteel. You know, it wasn't genteel. It was really, you know, a big part of that anti-police sentiment that helped the rioting spread. That anti-police sentiment was based really on a legacy of stop and search, right? And if you pay attention to policing in this country, racialized policing in this country, you'll understand that stop and search morphed from the sus laws 2-3 generations earlier, you know, in the 70s and 80s. And this is why, I guess this is what I mean by kind of, you know, nothing ever ends, it just sort of morphs into another form. And yeah, there's something about, I've heard this phrase recently, cultural value, which I think is code for black people think it's cool. In the context within which I heard it, you know. And you know, I mean, it's well documented that, you know, we, as a diaspora, you know, black folks can make something hot, right? Occasionally, to our credit and benefit, quite often, kind of, it gets extrapolated
Occasionally, you're saying occasionally, it's always the way, isn't it?
Occasionally to our credit and benefit, but
Oh,
quite often
okay,
it gets
sorry.
extrapolated and mainstreamed
Yeah, I missed that part.
and comes out as holiday or something, you know.
Exactly.
But yeah.
Jerk rice. I like Jamie Oliver.
Jamie, we love you. Other chefs are available.